Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. Chris, nice to have you on the show.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So how was lovely Cheltenham today? I probably said that wrong, right? It's Cheltenham. You're supposed to.
It's one of those. It's one of those words. The harder you try and say it right, the more difficult it gets, and the less convinced you are that you are saying it right. I think it's one of those. So yeah, I wouldn't even begin to go down there with you. I think I'd just get myself more confused. So
yeah, you probably have it better than I do. And then you're. It looks like you're close to the Welsh border, which is a whole other animal of pronunciations.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's lots of transfer between Cheltenham and Wales for sure. Yeah, people are going in and out all the time, and you used to have to pay to go into Wales. There was a toll bridge. You used to have to pay to go in, but it was free to get out. And that you can imagine there was lots of historical jokes about that. But that makes sense that they pull something like that, after so much history and evereverying. That's all you have to deal with. It could be a lot worse, right? It's not free to get out. So that was a joke, I think.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's interesting. So can you talk a little bit about your background and kind of Firestarter and high level look at that for those that don't know you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll sort of maybe start with the personal stuff, and then I'll just give a bit of Firestarter context to it. So personal background, I started off as a history degree in the UK, which I think, is what people always ask you, what you learn from a history degree. But my standard answer is, A, it helps you bring data and information from lots of sources and build your own argument around it. Yeah. And B, kind of it teaches you that the same things tend to happen again and again and again, just in slightly different ways. So started off with a history degree, went into, actually my first job post university was for a national charity, and kind of fell into a fundraising type role, corporate fundraising role. So actually if anybody's seen modern professional fundraising, it's a pretty sharp-elbowed kind of world. And then kind of took those skills into more formal sales roles in larger corporates, and just ended up working my way up the ladder kind of really quickly in terms of personal career development, and almost got to a point like in my sort of early to mid 30s where I think I'd been so ambitious that I achieved everything that I sort of set out to achieve, and sort of thought, well, actually, I don't really know what to do next, but always had this kind of, so I mean that's a massive simplification of years of work, but at the same time kind of was very much always very sales led in my approach, kind of went through sales leadership roles into kind of full business leadership roles of decent sized organizations, lots of business consolidation, mergers, kind of understanding different cultures crashing together. So got lots of insight to all the challenges around driving sales performance improvement in complex settings. So did that for a long time, but always had this kind of back of my mind objective of setting up my own entity. And through sort of various, twists and turns, the Firestarter business was born in 2012, fundamentally as an organization that works across businesses of all different sizes to drive sales effectiveness, and specifically to get businesses selling more of whatever it is they sell, whatever that takes. And I think that's the interesting thing, that what it takes in business A to drive that kind of sales improvement, it can be quite different from what it takes in business B.
Yeah, and we'll definitely dig into everything you're doing there. As a tangent, it might be a long or short. We'll see where we go on history, because I'm also a history major, and I'm really glad I did it. I think it's one of those things where people will respond to you and be like, "Why would you get that degree? How, is that really useful?" And I found it to be really useful in terms of just my lens on the world and context. And I'm not saying I know a lot more than anybody else, but I think that I see a tendency in myself and in others to sort of look back at their own lives, or maybe the generation behind them, and then expect everything to be the same for them and their lives based on a really snapshot, tiny butterfly wing flap of the grand scheme of history. And I think there's a little entitlement around that, because there's the sort of feeling where it's well, I'm entitled to this particular life, or to not have this hardship, or to not have this thing happen, when history just doesn't work like that. You don't have to go back that far for everything to just be crap, or everything to be crazy or different or whatever.
Completely. And I think we're just we're just visitors to this world, aren't we? We're here for a heartbeat of history, yeah, and as were our forefathers, and as were theirs, and as will be our descendants. And it's kind of, you can get really quite philosophical about it if you start digging into it, I think.
Yeah, and one person whose work that I love, not your countryman exactly, but up in Scotland, is Neil Ferguson. You know his work?
Yeah, no, I don't particularly know, but yeah, go on.
But he kind of, that's kind of his concept, is that like things are always in free fall, and we just sort of, there'll be like a short little period where that doesn't happen, and then we fool ourselves into thinking that will happen forever. And I think one example that he talks about is like in the 1950s, I might have this wrong a little bit, but it was in the UK, there was a pandemic that was not quite as bad as the one in the 20s that was globally, but it was pretty bad. And it's just lost to history. It killed way more people than COVID per capita. But it was because like the people then had this concept of there's just going to be bad years where lots of people die because the world wars had happened and all this, and so it's interesting.
Yeah, and the different lenses at different times, what people see as kind of contextually right, contextually wrong at different moments of history is fascinating, actually. And I think one of our clients uses the excellent phrase about some of their younger employees or his children even, which is, I'm not young enough to know everything yet, which I think can be very valid, because I think until you start to really get a few years under your belt, you don't necessarily realize that, exactly as you're saying, that the patterns of history repeat themselves, and you're never too far away from history kind of falling into some of the traps it's been in before.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I've always thought like that, the sort of like the more I learn, the less I know sort of thing.
Yeah,
that's always there. But then I heard like a really interesting counterpoint to that recently. I think it was by Eric Weinstein, and he was talking about like, what if the explorers of like the 1600s or the 1700s or even later, right about when right about the time when the world was pretty much fully circumnavigated. So maybe that's 1700s. I'm not sure exactly. But what if they were to say, well, the more we learn, the less we know, how much of like we will never chart the entire earth. They would have been dead wrong. So how do you square that circle? How do you figure out?
I think probably the only thing I can suggest is that probably as you get older, you realize that there's always more, isn't there, that you don't know. So you've got to keep going. Yeah. You've got to keep going, I suppose. Yeah.
Sorry.
Never be surprised that, or never assume you know everything. I guess that's probably the best conclusion, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And to sort of move this more towards business stuff, can you talk about kind of like you talked about your background in corporate, and then achieving lots of these goals and starting your own agency around Firestarter? So what inspired that? Like, what were you doing day one versus what's the day-to-day look like now in terms of like the service you're providing to clients?
I mean, excellent question. And one of my moments of humor really was, I remember very early in the Firestarter days, we produced a whole range of professionally recorded videos. And we were interviewed by a guy, and he just asked us lots of snapshot questions about the services that we delivered and how they all worked. And I think at that point, we didn't really have any clients. So we just kind of ad-libbed and said like semi-intelligent things about how we felt the business worked and all the principles that we genuinely felt we would be putting into our clients. And I do watch those sometimes. And actually, the reality is we absolutely foresaw what the service set would be and how it would work. So I think we were always really clear as a business that there was a sort of set of things that if you got them straight in your sales operation would make it work. And I don't think we have strayed far away from that at all. I think the significant journey that we as a business have gone on is we just, and I think this is a thing that all maturing businesses go on, either consciously or not consciously, but we certainly very consciously, we have learned and digested the things that really have an impact on clients, the things that people really like, and the things that maybe we think are brilliant, but are less, they land less well with them. And I think we've got certainly, I wouldn't necessarily use the word cynical, but certainly much more astute operationally as to how you frame a service and deliver a service that's going to have an impact in the business and that people are going to like. So I think it's just I don't think we've massively changed what we're doing, but we've built a model that we can deploy into staff apart from anything else.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I definitely want to dig into that and the sort of elements that go into that are important, the 80-20. First, just so people can kind of wrap their heads around things. Can you talk about like when you're onboarding a client, just tangibly what you're doing, just in a nutshell, and what the day-to-day is like a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So typically people come to us with like 2 or 3 key things that are issues for them. A big one is founders of businesses have maybe been running a business for 10, 15 years. They survived on energy and passion, but they've kind of hit a ceiling in terms of their growth. And they've also organizationally struggled to develop any kind of formalization that's really going to take them to a next level. And definition of next level could be either continued sales growth, or it could be the founder is trying to find a way to make the business function operationally with a far smaller dependency on them, but they haven't been able to do that. So that's a big area of our work, especially in kind of the small and medium-sized part of the marketplace. And I'll talk to that a little bit in a moment. In the other big kind of sort of area that comes our way is where people are trying to execute growth initiatives or execute ideas, and they just can't get themselves organized enough to do it, either because they're too busy doing the core thing they're doing.
And sorry to cut you off, and you're typically providing consulting and just meeting with clients and giving them ideas. Are you guys actually owning the process, or what does your involvement look like?
So we're a plug-in model, actually. That's our kind of model. So we're not kind of wave your arms around consultancy, turn up once a month and say a few things and disappear. Our model is we will plug in a team of generally somewhere between 4 and 5 people into a business, and either plug resource gaps, plug skills gaps, plug energy gaps to move these things forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. And going back to that first scenario where you have an owner that's kind of been at this for 10 or 15 years, what are the reoccurring things? I mean, one way to ask this question is like, if you could put it on a billboard for those people and just say like, stop doing A and start doing B, like what would that look like?
Well, a lot of it is getting it out of the boss's head. There's a huge amount of that. So it's like, how do you take what has like formed in the boss's head as a kind of almost an accidental sales process and formalize it so that it can be plugged into other resources? There's a lot of that in it, and that can play out in all kinds of ways. It can be hiring issues, it can be process issues, it can be collateral issues, it can be system issues, it can be a lot of it's management issues, actually. Just because you're a founder of a business doesn't make you a good sales manager. And so all of those kind of things play out really, really well. And I think removal of dependency on bosses for the revenue expectations of their business is a massive thing for us.
Right. That makes a lot of sense from a high level, and to dig into it. So yeah, it could be hiring issues, it could be collateral, it could be a lot of different things. I guess, is there one that's more common, or is there like a building block that you find needs to be in place before you can do a lot of the other stuff?
Quite a bit. I think quite a common one is a lack of clarity about why people buy. So why are people buying the thing that you sell? So the founders, as I said a few minutes ago, they tend to survive on energy and passion. They tend to be able to sell the thing they sell, often based on that. When you're trying to plug that into broadening resources and new people and people who don't have that absolute investment in the business, it becomes a whole different mechanic for the way that the sales process has to be executed. And commonly, they can't explain it themselves. They can't get it into other people.
Yeah, it's super interesting, because if you have like a brand new business, it's almost easier in a way, because you're just trying to find product market fit and do all these things and try things and find what works. I think what's more risky is if you have a business that's been around like a decade, you have product market fit, but it's almost like one of these old paintings that's like covered in dust, and you've got to like clear out the dust to figure out where the painting actually lives. And the
Correct.
risk might be that like in the process of clearing out the dust, maybe you cut away at the paint and cut away at the thing that's like actually working. So do you have any thoughts on that? Like the first foundational piece, finding clarity, you already have it, something's working, you know, because you're at this X level. How do you figure out why people buy in that situation?
So there's always a big part of our philosophy is we always start from a position of massive respect for these people, because running a business, building a business is a difficult thing to do. So if you've built a business from zero and it's doing well and you're in year 10, year 12, year 15, like big congratulations, you're doing something superbly right. So big tick. I think a lot of it, so we really commonly will start with kind of like a pain points based approach, where you really start challenging, in the first instance, often the bosses, as to what are the pain points that people buying from you are really experiencing. And that is one of those kind of interrogations where it commonly starts off quite superficial, and people will give you quite superficial answers. But then when you really start to dig into the pain points that are really behind the buying decisions, and bearing in mind, we work across all kinds of industries. So the superficial pain points are often like very product related or service related, depending on what somebody's selling. But in reality, when you start digging into it, it tends to be much more personal motivators that are driving buying behaviors. And you can quite quickly in a business start to switch their whole philosophy as to why people are buying from them and how the thing that they are doing is solving problems, which I think, again, it's a little bit founders and entrepreneurs, sort of a little point coming in a couple of minutes on entrepreneurs. Founders and entrepreneurs tend to be very, I guess, intuitive and instinctive about these things, but it's the same point. Actually then bottling that and putting it into an engine in your business that can do that for you is something they really struggle with.
Yeah. And are there any sort of like punchy or poignant questions that you ask to get at that, right? Where like for example, a lot of our listeners, they're agencies, so there's like all these different variables, more than most companies, that they might be selling to. One variable's vertical, another variable's service. They might have a bundle of different services. Other variables, the title they're selling to, and there might be others. Are there any questions you ask to figure out? Like,
I mean, there's some really neat little exercises you can do really quickly, and I always describe them as sort of almost like park bench exercises. You could go and sit on the park bench and do these kind of exercises in 5 minutes. But like a really neat exercise that we regularly do with people is say, okay, just write a list of the common problems that your buyers face. And normally what happens, and we say to people, see if you can get to 12. Yeah. And normally what happens when people say this is going to be difficult, normally by the time they get to 5 or 6 or 7, they're running out. Yeah. Which actually is fascinating, because or they're running out, or they're starting to repeat themselves. Yeah. And ordinarily, actually, and I really urge people to do this exercise because it's so powerful. If you do that, kind of write down the 12 problems that your customers commonly face, people that they struggle to get to 12, they start repeating themselves. And actually, if you then start saying, okay, let's synergize a bit, let's really look at the list you've done, in reality, really quickly, people will start to pick out 4 or 5 big pain point groups. And suddenly they're there, actually. And you can see the light bulbs coming on and people getting themselves into a new place with it. The other side point I was going to make on the kind of entrepreneur element of it is that one of the kind of intrinsic things that is one of the biggest benefits of entrepreneurism, but also one of its biggest hindrances, is that people are very kind of ephemeral, shiny, go on to the next thing. And actually getting people to stick to a plan and stick to a course of action is one of the most significant kind of elements of this type of execution, actually.
Yeah. And I think it's even more accentuated in a B2B or like an in-person sales situation, especially if the owner is running sales, because we're humans and we're emotional creatures, and you have a sales call that goes really well or really badly or whatever. And you have like a few of those in a row. and then it affects something that might be working historically, right?
Yeah.
Versus if we were selling widgets online, you just look at a report. It's a completely different situation, you know?
Yeah, and it's actually technical as well. And I think a lot of and this, you know, this plays out in big corporates as well, not just smaller settings, potentially even more in big corporates. I think people in selling roles often fall into the trap of ignoring the mechanics of the selling process. Very common in the smaller businesses where they've built a business based on a thing that they do, and their passion is the thing, and they think talking about the thing is what's going to make them generate revenue, which often it can do for a founder. But actually building technique around the way that you run your selling process, and just like an athlete or a musician, being kind of clear that you can't just work on your technique once and then hope it will see you through for the rest of the time. You have to practice, you have to go back to it, you have to challenge yourself. Am I doing this bit right? Am I doing this bit right? And that's what builds consistency of results.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the times it's very much attention to detail work in terms of what happens when, what information is revealed when,
correct, completely,
and so on. And it's you can't just wing it. You know, it takes doing it over and over again. So that makes a lot of sense. So I think you've covered, you know, the importance of clarity, and I love the park bench concept and exercises you can do to kind of like get to the things that actually matter to customers. You mentioned hiring. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what's maybe and to zero that in, because hiring is a huge topic. But if we talk about hiring salespeople, which is kind of the focus, what's been your experience? Like, how did you go about hiring salespeople, either for yourself or clients early on, versus how do you do it now? What have you found to work well? And that could be in terms of like process, round 1 versus round X, or however you're thinking about it.
So I think in one of those great sort of 97.2% of statistics are made up on the spot moments, I have historically made up various numbers about the number of salespeople I've interviewed in my life, but it must be thousands. Yeah, I must have literally interviewed thousands of salespeople in my life. And certainly as I got into my stride in my kind of corporate years, I would say that my approach was pretty tough, and it was a very kind of numbers led kind of conversation, and based on a lot of reality that. So firstly, there's an old sort of adage that good salespeople earning good money generally aren't on the market for new jobs, because they've got it sorted. They've worked out how they're earning their money, and they stick to the thing that generates income for them. So there's a sort of almost kind of assumption that a lot of the salespeople out on the job market aren't particularly good salespeople, which is a difficult place to start from. And
do you believe that assumption, generally speaking?
I mean, I've certainly seen a lot of CVs that indicate, like resumes that indicate that assumption isn't far off, actually. And I think, again, if you start from another assumption that if a salesperson can't sell themselves, then chances are they're not going to be brilliant at selling the thing that you want them to sell. So again, you have to, it's sort of buyer beware when you're interviewing potential sales guys, that they are going to try and do a number on you, because that's literally their world. So I certainly know, and I would still carry this forward today, and sometimes I challenge myself as to whether I do it as well these days as I used to. But digging into the track record of the sales guy in interview, and really understanding in roles they've done previously, have they performed? And if they have performed, how consistently? Were there kind of glory orders that kind of covered up lack of consistency generally, and stuff like that? Because the reality is, if they've got a track record of not performing in other settings, the likelihood is they're not going to perform in your setting. So I think that there's a lot of that, and there's also a kind of understanding the nature of the beast, and the reality that, I mean, certainly back in the day, you wanted a salesperson with a bit of edge. Yeah, you wanted somebody that was a bit pushy. So whilst they might not be the person that you would like go out for dinner with every night of the week. Like you wanted certain attributes in a seller that you knew would push them through. I think it's softened actually in recent years, because I think the way people buy has changed quite significantly, which is is well covered material, I think, i.e. the buyer has the opportunity to make themselves significantly more informed much earlier in the buying journey. So obviously web research, all kinds of information available to them. So potentially the role of the salesperson is less carrying somebody not quite the right word, but quite forcefully through a selling process. Sure. And much more about facilitating a purchase, actually. And I think that is definitely interesting. Yeah. And informs persona type, I think, in sales recruitment.
Right. And I think Dan Pink has written some about this, where information's in more parity than it used to be between parties. So that changes things. Still, persistence matters. And that I've interviewed thousands, but I've interviewed dozens, and that does ring true to me that, a lot of the times the best salespeople are going to be currently employed. So is that an argument towards poaching, towards recruiters? Like, are you relying on that more than the general population of people that apply? Or how do you feel about process to kind of get tactical?
Interesting question, because I think, again, if you reflect perhaps on, that feels like a thesis, the history of sales recruitment. Yeah. If you reflect on the history of sales recruitment, I mean, without a doubt, if you went back 10, 15 years, the absolute go-to process would be to use recruitment consultants and specialists to hire sales guys. I think, again, perhaps the advent of freer access to web advertising, job boards, that kind of thing, perhaps encourages people more to do it themselves. Yeah, because especially in smaller settings where they see a cost-saving opportunity by not using third parties. But I think I actually increasingly am coming back to the mindset that says, if you want to get good sales guys, go and get someone to find you a good sales guy. Get them to do some of the work for you. I think that's definitely where my head is in recent times, actually.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that makes sense. And with that, how do you feel about references? And how do you tee those up if you find them useful?
What? As in asking former employers to give references and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, or how to use them, the usefulness in general, how to get information to ask the right questions on reference calls.
I mean, it's an interesting one. And again, if I reflect on both personal experience and experiences I've seen in client settings, I think some businesses are very sort of religious about asking for references and kind of checking them and referring them. Some businesses trust their own judgment through a recruitment process and think, well, we've done due diligence, we've put somebody through a tough process, so kind of we're going to back our instincts. I have a slightly cynical view of it, which is that most people would not identify someone to act as a referee if they thought they were going to say something that was going to be unduly negative about them. So you're unlikely to get deep negativity at that point, but you do see it. I mean, I've definitely had experiences where people have pretty well said, do not hire that person.
Yeah, which I haven't had too many of those, but I disagree slightly. I think I found it to be useful in providing broader context on non-public information. There's a great article that I've stolen a lot from by this guy named Graham Duncan about hiring. It's there's a bunch of reference questions I've poached, but some of them are sort of framing things out. So it's hey, I'm here to find the right position for this person. Everything you say is off the record. Who's the best person you've ever seen in this role? If that person's a 100, where does this other where does this person fall?
Yeah, great question. Yeah.
And and what's interesting is I've had some sort of intriguing situations where I have more information than all the other parties. So then you kind of start to be this private investigator, and you're putting together what actually happened in this company. And as usual, it's nobody's perfect. Sort of I found situations where the person that we're interviewing is on the level, and the boss that I'm getting the reference from doesn't quite know why this person left. So they're assuming things. that are wrong because I have the other information from what this person's telling me, and you kind of have to square those things together. But yeah, I mean, in general, most people are going to provide good references.
Your questions there reminded me that for years I've had five interview questions that I pretty well ask every single time, which exactly to the method you were just describing, they reveal so much. Yeah. And so I'll tell you the five questions just because people generally find them like interesting. So, and again, if you look at it in the context of salespeople, it's interesting. So the first one is, tell me about a real punch the air moment in your career. That's a great question, because if it's a salesperson, if their answer is not, I got this massive deal, yeah, then something is probably wrong. Yeah. If they start to tell you about a spreadsheet that they like engineered that did lots of clever formulas, this is not a person that is going to be a top salesperson for you. The opposite question of that obviously is that, tell me about a real jaw on the floor moment. Everything's going wrong, nothing's working. And again, if in a sales setting, people will tend to go to I lost this deal, yeah, and then you get into quite a nice conversation around why and how and what it taught them. So similar principle, like opposite question. So which is what triggered me actually. Who's the best boss you've ever had and why question. And people will kind of, again, it's almost predictable, but I love the question, because what it does is it tells you how people like to be managed, and whether your management style is likely to conflict with that. And invariably people will talk about someone that was a good counsel for them, didn't micromanage them. And you get a lot out of that. And then the opposite question again, obviously, is tell me about the worst boss you've ever had and why. Actually, probably more than 80% of the time, people will name their current boss.
Yeah. Which else would they be on the interview? So
yeah. And the last one is like, tell me about the last thing somebody did at work that really wound you up. And I love that question, because what it does is you see them think and they think, what can I think? And then they will go into full flow. And they often will talk for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes about something. And my historic technique is to let them talk themselves out, leave a little silence, and then say something like, that really wound you up, didn't it? And then they will go again. Yeah. And you can have people talking for 10 minutes if you're not careful. The purpose of the question is to culturally understand, how are they going to fit in your organization? Right. Are the kind of things that you do likely to wind them up? How are they likely to react? Yeah. And it's really intriguing, actually. Yeah.
I love that. That's really interesting. Yeah. Because you get to see them at their worst in a way, and you got to figure out if their worst can fit. Yeah. That's great. I think yours is probably a little better, but one question that I've asked kind of related to that is, let's say we're 3-6 months in and this just didn't work out. What do you think happened? What do you think went wrong? Yeah. And the worst answers that you more commonly get are, well, I just, they'll take all the blame, right? Because they don't want to kind of address that question head on and honestly. So they'll be like, well, it's, I just didn't perform, or it's all on me, versus well, it could be because it's on me, but also maybe expectations weren't set the right way. Maybe I misunderstood. They'll get into specifics, and they'll actually soberly kind of do a post-mortem on the situation, which I found to be more impressive and kind of more honest. Yeah.
And supports the reverse engineering of not getting to that position.
Right. Exactly. So that's definitely been helpful. Yeah. And with that, what, let's go back to bounce back a little bit to that situation where there's an owner of 10, 12 years, they're managing the helm, selling all the time. Mm-hmm. What does that first sales hire tend to look like for them? What do you think that person should or shouldn't be doing?
So I think, if I reflect back on businesses we've worked with, I think often the mistake people have made and will want to make again is a little bit what I was saying earlier, is they confuse, I know lots about whatever it is we are doing, with I'm a good salesperson. Yeah. So I think that there's definitely a focus in those early hires to get someone who is attitude led. So going to have a great attitude and fundamentally has a really good set of selling skills. Absolutely needs to fit into the market that client is operating in. But and completely needs to have the ability to digest kind of relevant levels of product knowledge. But first and foremost, I think we're looking for someone who can take accountability for a number and activity. I think that has to be the focus. And so it's almost that what not to hire is easier to say than what to hire. So don't just go and hire someone who's a subject matter expert, because that does not mean they're going to be great at selling in your business. When I hear people saying we're going to hire John, he's been in this industry for 35 years, my heart sinks. Yeah.
Right. That's the classic trap, right? Because it's you're optimizing for the wrong thing. It's like learning a product or an industry, that's a matter of weeks, or less.
Yeah, completely. And it's also, I think, part of that early kind of analysis, pain points, understanding is all directed at really getting a feel for why are people buying from you? What problem are you solving for them? And therefore, specifically, what level of knowledge do you need to be able to communicate to deal with that part of the sales process? Because the founder boss guy will often say things like, well, it's taken me 40 years to build my subject matter expertise on this, so no one's going to be able to sell it. That is not true. Yeah, it's not true.
Yeah, exactly. And to give the devil's due, that stuff is useful and subject matter expertise matters, but it's learnable. And if it wasn't learnable, then no business would ever be able to scale, right?
Well, yeah. And people didn't come out of the womb being a subject matter expert on communications technology. Like people have learned it. Yeah. So
yeah, that's a really good point. So Chris, I guess kind of getting towards the end of the time.
Sure.
Yeah, I'd love to ask just kind of what are you working on these days? What are you excited about, for the next weeks or months at Firestarter?
So I suppose probably longer term strategy for us is we're superbly comfortable with our operational model. We know the marketplace is there. We know that at really all levels of organizational size, we have value to add and methodology to do it. I think certainly in the last 2 years or so, it's become very evident to us that there's large elements of our model we can deliver digitally, and I think we definitely have a long-term appetite to make as much of our kind of content and our methodology accessible to broader markets. So I mean, we don't have any these days, particularly any global inhibitions. We'll go anywhere, talk to anybody. But similarly, there's people who have got very large budgets, but there's people who've got very modest budgets. And I think we're pretty open about trying to find ways for everybody at every level to access good stuff that will help them sell more. So digital's a big thing for us going forwards.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there's so many places to take that. And that's been one of the bigger focal points for us too. And for guests we're having on the show is I think these lines are getting blurred. I think we're all becoming software businesses to some degree at this point. So it makes a lot of sense. And Chris, this was so much fun. I think we covered a lot of ground here. How can people take this further, like learn what you're up to, follow you guys and get in touch and all that good stuff?
Yeah, I mean, so absolutely, you can find us on LinkedIn easily. That's probably a good place to start. We do a lot of decent content on LinkedIn, or find our website, firestartersolutions.co.uk. That's our main site. So just like hunt us out on there, reach out, happy to talk. We'll talk to anybody. Everybody's got a sales challenge, and sometimes people, as I say, sometimes people come with large budgets, some people come with no budget, but there's always value in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get all that linked up. Chris, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, brilliant, Dan. Thanks so much.